the race on the economy is narrowing, interest rates coming down, inflation low now, the economy still strong. And compared to the first half of the year, the economy is coming right for the Democrats. And I was thinking to myself, if I was a Conservative Party candidate or cabinet minister, a Grant Shapps or a Rupert Harrison who lost or didn't win his seat this summer, and you look at the fact that inflation's low in Britain, the OECD is upgrading the growth forecast for Britain for this year, the Bank of England is cutting interest rates, wouldn't you be thinking, in that parallel with Harris, it's turning for the Democrats? Could it have turned for the Conservatives? What the hell was Rishi Sunak doing, having the general election back in June, July, when he could have waited till now?
Well, I've had lots of conversations subsequent to the election and the election result with the very senior people around that decision, and it's still totally baffling because almost everyone I've spoken to was completely against it, and I don't think they're just saying that after the fact. But no, you're right. Look,
who was in favour then? Just Rishi?
Well, I think it was a very, very small group of Rishi Sunak and his very core kind of inner political advisor team. And they were motivated by things like, well, maybe this prison crisis is going to blow up. Maybe the Rwanda scheme's not going to be operational in time for the election. And a kind of feeling, nothing's working. So let's try going to the country early. But I mean, anyway, we're getting sidetracked here. The American Constitution sets the date of the American election. And the Tories should have stuck with a 5-year Parliament Act, which I bequeath them.
But the autumn date is definitely working for Harris compared to if it was earlier in the year.
And, well, of course, it would have been Biden, wouldn't it? It's interesting, though, if you look at... So let's just quickly look at the two approaches. So Trump's message, which is, I am going to penalise anyone who offshores their manufacturing to not just China, but Mexico and Europe, is very aggressive. I mean, he picks on particular companies like John Deere, the tractor manufacturer, who had talked of moving some jobs from Iowa to Mexico. And he says, I'm going to put a 200% tariff on your tractors coming from Mexico. And he specifically says, I'm going to go after car makers in Europe too. So it's not all, as I say, kind of cast in an anti-Chinese thing at all. It's just as, very much America first. And this has been the one consistent thing in Trump's political life from way back when he was a business leader and actually supporting the Democrats and giving money to Hillary Clinton's campaigns. He was always in favor of tariffs. Back then it was against Japan, and now it's against all these other countries as well. So he's got that message and, all the kind of classic economic evidence. I mean, he can produce some economists who disagree with this, but generally the kind of classic economic evidence is that tariffs don't work and they hit consumers and Americans will be worse off and the American economy will be less productive. And then on the Kamala Harris side, in her speech last night, she has some things which would be quite familiar, I think, to a British audience around sort of tax credits for families and more house building. But she also repeats this thing about price controls or stopping what she calls price gouging by big American food companies. And that is a hark back to kind of prices policies from the 1970s. And as I say, neither of these things really feature certainly in the British economic debate, and they don't feature in European economic debates either, really.
It's really interesting. I mean, the tariffs thing is so easy. It's such an easy form of populism. We will make people who import into our country, the foreign companies, we will make them pay an extra tax, a tariff, and that will mean that our domestic manufacturers will do much better. In the words of your mate J.D. Vance, the vice presidential nominee, we believe 1 million cheap knockoff toasters aren't worth the price of a single American manufacturing job. But of course, all the evidence is that what happens is people still buy the toasters. They just cost more money. And they cost more money, and that means that consumers, American citizens, are worse off. And So this might help an American toaster manufacturer, but in the end, the people who pay for this are ordinary citizens. And he's not saying we're only going to have tariffs on Chinese toaster makers or car makers. It's everybody. So at a time when America needs to sort of build alliances for a dynamic global economy and to make sure that the threat of China, as seen by whether it's Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, is managed, they're going to have tariffs on British and French and German exports as well from around the world. And they say it's okay because we're going to get this money from these tariffs and then we're going to use that to cut taxes. But actually, all of the evidence is it won't pay for tax cuts. The tax cuts will be paid for by a big increase in borrowing, which sort of slightly contradicts his promise to have low inflation and low interest rates as well, because that would mean higher interest rates. So the Trump message is, completely incoherent.
What about Kamala Harris on prices?
Well, the Kamala Harris, you are right. We were looking this up. The last time we had a Secretary of State for prices was Roy Hattersley in the 1970s.
And that was the actual title, wasn't it?
It was the Department for Prices and Consumer Protection. And there were two Secretaries of State. It was set up by Harold Wilson in 1974, and the first Secretary of State was Barbara Castle, and the second one was Roy Hattersley, and then Margaret Thatcher abolished it in 1979.
Come on, let's hear Roy Hattersley talking about it.
When they demonstrate an increase in costs, I thought we needed something much more specific, much more positive, and I thought, and I'm glad to say we'll be doing it quite soon, I wanted to give the Price Commission the opportunity to examine specific price increases and, if necessary, instruct the company to operate a freeze. I think things are now so bad that a freeze on some specific occasions, not a general freeze, but on some specific occasions, is justified. And I think all I saw in your programme at the beginning suggests that things are bad enough to justify some rather more extreme measures, and the specific price freeze is one of them.
That's a young Roy Hattersley. Roy Hattersley is still very much with us and going strong, isn't he, in his 90s?
So we have had price controls in the modern era.
They didn't work.
No, but the prices for the utilities, you remember the first formula for setting electricity prices was RPI minus X. So prices could only rise each year less than the RPI inflation rate. But that's where you're talking about a regulated monopoly or quasi-monopoly utility provider. We have a price cap for energy prices, which the government has managed in the last few years when they've been very high. But those are very much the exceptions, and all of the evidence is attempting to intervene on behalf of consumers to try and cap prices of contested goods in the marketplace just lead to distortion, queue. It hits investment. This is bad for the economy. We haven't been back to days of trying to control private prices set in the marketplace since the 1970s. And, is Kamala Harris... America's always had a very strong antitrust competition policy, right back to the...
Teddy Roosevelt
in the 1910s. But to do it not through competition policy, but trying to manage the prices, it's quite a throwback.
Yeah, look, the interesting thing, of course, is that despite all this economic nonsense from Trump and Harris around tariffs and prices, the truth is the American economy is outperforming not just the British economy, but all European economies, and really pulling away. And that's clear in those OECD forecasts, which you mentioned in the British context, that have just been published. And of course, the American economy is continuing to demonstrate its capacity to be, the home of ingenuity and creativity and productivity with things like the AI revolution, which is largely led by big American companies.
That's right.
So whoever becomes president of the United States, I'm not sure they'll actually end up doing all of these things. But they will do some, the tariffs, things like tariffs, which has to be said also, Joe Biden's imposed on, for example, European car manufacturers and Chinese car manufacturers. They've entered the mainstream, and it's a world away from when you and I got started in politics, and American presidents were striking trade deals and asking China to join the World Trade Organization and, promoting things like NAFTA.
It's true, and you can see why, look, from Trump's point of view, the reason why he doubled down so hard on his attack on immigration against the Democrats as his main economic message was because I think he always feared that the economy might get better, but the immigration thing would still be galvanising, especially across those Sunbelt states. Whether or not that is enough to combat a strengthening economy and lower inflation in the Rust Belt remains to be seen. And this economic message this economic debate is central to the outcome of the election.